I've wanted to visit the site of the Hinterkaifeck murders for many years, and I'm finally getting the chance to. It's very sad. The farmstead is no longer here, but I wanted to kind of show you a couple of the landmarks associated with the case, because I don't see a lot of people actually visiting where this happened. The first thing you'll see is a beautiful cross to commemorate the victims, but there's not really any writing on it, and without hearing the story told, you'd have no way of knowing why this was here. And the farmstead would have stretched out right behind here where this new road now goes that leads out of town, and a outbuilding was on the right, the main body of the house on the left, and behind that was an engine room. It would have been right behind that large tree, but the engine room didn't connect to the rest of the house. However, on March 30th, 1922, a day before the murders took place, the father of the family, Andreas Gruber, said he saw footprints leading to that engine room. The lock had been broken, and no footprints led back into the woodline. The footprints seemed to follow this direction here into the wood line. Now, that is immediately very insidious, but it was snowing, and what I would venture to guess is that the overhang on the roof made it kind of difficult to track footprints. You wouldn't go back the way you came. You'd probably follow the area around after finding out that there was no entry to the house, and make your way sort of under the roof to the front of the house to take this road back to town. Now, the town over here is called Groburn, and these farmsteads up here belong to Lawrence Schlittenbauer and Michael Pohl, names who both come up in the case fairly often. Now, the murders took place sometime intervening in those days because their bodies were not discovered for quite a while afterwards. As is always the case when I visit these true crime sites, if I get any of the locations wrong, please correct me. I'm just piecing together as best I can old maps published in the 1950s. This road, from an old map I've seen in the 50s, wasn't really there because that now connects to the main highway, but it leads to the nearest forest, and as near as I can tell, it could have been the path that was taken by the man whose footprints were seen by the father of the family, Andreas Gruber. And the reason why I stress the importance of the engine room is twofold. Firstly, the engine room was connected to the outside of the house, and somebody in the wood line would probably have believed that inside of that engine room there was access to the farmstead. So they approached from that wood line along the road I'm on now, broke into a flimsy lock because all it was really locking was the engine, and then left, presumably underneath the overhang so the footprints couldn't be seen, and because it was very early morning, probably walked back to town on this road right here. And the second reason for the importance of the engine house is that people in town over there started realizing that something must have been amiss after seeing the cattle grazing for a number of days and nobody leaving the house, but still seeing smoke coming from the chimney, because someone came to fill an order to fix the engine in that engine house, waited around for an hour, heard nobody, and finally spent several hours fixing it, but nobody came out to pay him. So he went into town and told everybody that there was nobody at the farmstead. So the Schlittenbauer and Pohl farmers came up to investigate, and that is when the bodies were found. It's believed that the murders were committed on the 31st of March, 1922, right here on the old farmstead, the same day that Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, took up duties on the home. And several days later, after nobody in town had heard from the Gruber family or from the maid, a local repairman came in to work on the engine and found the engine house unlocked. Well, he sat around for about an hour whistling, and he heard the cows mooing very loudly. Now, in town, there was a sort of reputation that the father of the family was a bit of a strange man, and because nobody had seen him going into the fields to feed his cows, he had finished the repairs and went into town, passing several farms of people who knew the Gruber family quite well. And so eventually, the nearby Schlittenbauer farm was notified, and Lawrence asked his two sons to go and make contact with the family. They knocked on the windows, but nothing could be heard. And buried next to the Gruber family and their maid, Maria Baumgartner, is Johann Schlittenbauer, who was 16 years old at the time when his father Lawrence sent him to check and see if he could make contact with the family at the Hinterkaifeck farm. He lived until 1977. So Lawrence's 16-year-old son, Johann, and his stepson, Joseph, went to go make contact at around 3:30 p.m., but finding nobody at the farm, eventually Lawrence Schlittenbauer, along with Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel, decided to come down themselves. Eventually, so said the papers, Schlittenbauer sort of broke off and pulled a key from his pocket, and it was noted later in the case that Andreas Gruber had lost his key in the days leading up to the murder, and opened the door where the bodies were found. Now, it's said that Schlittenbauer pulled the bodies out of the pine straw, but it's understandable. I think if he were the one who broke in the day before the murders and stole a key, he would naturally hide that fact from the two men he brought here with them. Seconding that, he actually had a romantic relationship with Victoria Gruber, who lived in the house. However, all of these rumors about Andreas Gruber, Victoria's father, being a strange fellow, eventually compounded. And because Weimar Republic Germany and Bavaria in the 1920s were very, very strange places, the story took much darker tones, that perhaps Andreas Gruber was in an incestuous relationship with Victoria, and this sort of took a lot of heat off of Lawrence Schlittenbauer. However, Schlittenbauer was the one who found the bodies, and it's only natural for some suspicion to fall on him if he has the keys in his pockets, and he broke off to pull them out of his own pocket to open the door. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Carl Gabriel theory, the idea that this man who had actually survived his supposed death in no man's land in World War I came back to find his former lover sleeping with her father Andreas, and perhaps with a baby born of incest, and in a moment of rage, he decided to kill the whole family. Now, this theory rests on the idea that he had spoken often in the trenches of World War I, specifically Arras, that he wanted to go to Russia and that he supported the Soviet Union. I've seen this theory mentioned in several different videos. Now, it makes no sense because the Soviet Union didn't exist at that time. There was a revolutionary movement in Russia that was growing very quickly, but he never said, I want to go to the Soviet Union, because there was no Soviet Union. And it would have made no sense to survive being shot in no man's land. Sure, the body was never recovered, but millions of bodies were never recovered. He almost certainly died. And to the fact that Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria were in a very unusual relationship, probably incestuous, that's pointed out by Lawrence Schlittenbauer, the farmer that lived right down the road in the town of Grobern. Now, this relationship, it needs to be mentioned. It's sad. It was an abusive relationship. Andreas Gruber had an abusive mentality towards his family. Several of his children died prematurely. The neighbors in town saw them locked in the sort of underneath the house, and they were crying. It was a very poor relationship. So when Lawrence Schlittenbauer did some work on the farm and began a romantic relationship with Victoria Gruber a couple years after her husband died in World War I, she confided in him that her father was raping her. And it seems that at some point she had a child named Joseph, who immediately she claimed Lawrence Schlittenbauer was the father of. Lawrence immediately went to the police and said that Andreas Gruber is his daughter. This was actually brought to court, and in a legal settlement, it was revealed that they were both charged with incest. Now, I think that, and it's proven because legally Lawrence Schlittenbauer later went to the law and said, but the son is mine. Joseph Gruber is mine. He was the father of Joseph Gruber, in my opinion. And so when the murders were committed, he was so eager to get back into the house to look for his son Joseph. And you might ask, why did he have the key on him? Certainly the relationship with Victoria was ongoing. They had argued to some extent, but they had buried the hatchet in the argument between himself and Andreas, and he was still coming around the farm, and after all, he only lived a half a mile up the road, so it makes sense that he would have a key, and he didn't do his best to hide it from the other two farmers that came down to check the farm with him. So I think that this was probably a homeless person, probably somebody that came along in the woods. If it was Lawrence Schlittenbauer, why would he try to break into the engine outhouse? Makes no sense, because he would have known that wouldn't give him access to the farm proper. The story around Lawrence Schlittenbauer doesn't seem to add up. In the rear view window here, we can see the site of the old Hinterkaifeck farm, which was torn down nearly a century ago. But I want to drive into the town of Groburn, passing the farms of Michael Pohl and Lawrence Schlittenbauer, to show you that you have to cross this little hill right here. After you get to the opposite side, you can't look back and actually see the Hinterkaifeck farm, which is a very interesting discrepancy. And these two farms here, the farms of Michael Pohl and Lawrence Schlittenbauer, along with the rest of the town, you can see that the Hinterkaifeck farmstead would not have been visible to the community. But they could have seen some smoke rising from the chimneys because whoever the killer was, he stayed in the house for several days after the murders had been committed. And in the center of downtown Groburg, at the intersection of Romerweg and Ebergstrasse, is more likely where the Lawrence Schlittenbauer farm actually was. These are old maps, and a lot of these are very new homes that sprung up in the years intervening, but it looks like it's on the left side of the road that forms a sort of wedge in town, right about where this new house now sits. And back in the day, it doesn't reflect any small pilgrimage church in the area. But Lawrence Schlittenbauer was naturally mentioned as a suspect because he had that legal trouble with Victoria Gruber over the fathership of her son Joseph. And because this is on the side of the road that is closer to the Hinterkaifeck farmstead, I think this is Schlittenbauer's farmhouse, but this could equally likely be it, because this is an older farming building that doesn't appear to be on maps from the 1950s that were later printed to sort of show a layout of the murders. And these homes were built right on top of Michael Pohl's old farmstead, located right across from Lawrence Schlittenbauer's farm, which I believe to be right over here, possibly that building on the right. Now, when these men were told that the farm just up the road of the Gruber family was totally unresponsive and that it didn't seem like anybody was in there, Schlittenbauer sent his son and his stepson, age 19 and 6, I believe. They didn't hear any response, so they took off in a party of 3 to investigate, and Lawrence acted somewhat unusual when they found the bodies. That looks like an older section of building, and as odd as it seems, a lot of these families stay in the local villages. You've actually got the Schlittenbauer sort of service right over here, literally on the road to the Hinterkaifeck farmstead, which is up over a small hill. And naturally, the buildings that you can see from the site of Hinterkaifeck's murders were not the farmsteads of the Schlittenbauers. Now, Victoria had this good faith. She told Lawrence Schlittenbauer, and then she had a child. And immediately she said that this child belongs to Lawrence Schlittenbauer. And it's at that moment that Schlittenbauer went to the police and said, this child was probably born of incest. Andreas Gruber is her own daughter. Now, I don't believe this to be the case, because Andreas Gruber very likely would have just gotten his daughter an abortion or murdered the child, because several other of his children had died of poor treatment. I think that this was Lawrence Schlittenbauer's child, and I think that the case is further pointed out because when he went to the police, Gruber and his daughter Victoria were both charged with incest. That charge stuck, and he eventually claimed the child, Joseph Gruber, as his own. He legally was the parent of Joseph Gruber. So when he went to the farm with the other 2 farmers, he pulled the key out of his pocket and opened the door right in front of them. And it would make no sense for him to hide the key if he snuck in. And on top of that, there were a couple of other incidents. Firstly, why would you break into the engine house looking for a door leading to the inside of the barn if you've been inside of the barn several times and you know that there's no door that comes from that direction? He could have simply used his own key. And then on April 1st, 1922, when those coffee salesmen come in, they actually hear, they put their ear against the door, they hear someone tending to the stove. They bang on the door for several minutes, nobody answers, and they walk back into town, passing Lawrence Schlittenbauer's farm. He answers the door and they tell him that nobody's there. Now, if Lawrence Schlittenbauer had murdered the entire family and continued living in their barn for several days, why would he then be at the farm after they just heard him there? It's a one-way road. You would have seen him sprinting up to his own farm. Clearly, I don't think it was Lawrence Schlittenbauer. I think Lawrence Schlittenbauer accidentally created this theory that Joseph Gruber was an incestuous child from Victoria and her father, Andreas. I think that that whole line of theories is very sad. I think it was a hobo or a Freikorps member, because there's a whole theory about the Gump brothers who had hid out in the woods and wanted to perhaps harm or kill Andreas Gruber because he was a very well-known abuser. And I think that after killing him, someone might have seen, and then everybody was either killed or lured to the farm afterwards. And even though these buildings look pretty old on the way from the Schlittenbauer and Pohl farmsteads to the Gruber farmstead, I don't think they were there in 1922 because they don't really reflect on period-accurate maps. And the old Gruber farmstead at Hinterkaifeck was right up there. The footprints, which were noticed by Andreas Gruber the day before the murder, that didn't have any exit footprints, any footprints leading back to the wood line, came from here. I can't think of a more creepy place for a hideout of a killer in the 1920s.